Hello YouTube. Today let's talk about cheap basses, specifically this cheap bass. As I mentioned in a previous video, I have been looking for an entry-level, very low-cost bass for a friend of mine who wants to learn to play bass. She plays a little guitar, she's got an acoustic guitar that she plays, but she really wants to be a bass player. And so I told her I would find her a good deal on a bass that would allow her to try out playing bass, give her something to learn with, and get a little experience and get to know what she likes about basses, because you don't really know what, whether you're a precision kind of bass player, a jazz kind of bass player, something fancier and more modern, until you actually start playing basses and you get your hands on them. So I've been looking, and in the beginning I kind of was looking at Squiers, I was looking at Yamahas, Ibanez, the usual sort of suspects in terms of who makes good quality, low-priced instruments. And the budget was about $100. And I wanted something that would be good enough to where she could play it for a year or two, get in a band if she wanted to play in a band, that kind of thing. But then also, no expectation of it being something that would grow forever with her. Just gonna, give it a year or two, and then we can sell this one for her and help her upgrade to something a little better. So, because of the internet, I expanded my search to include a brand called SX. These are Chinese basses imported by Rondo Music and sold by rondomusic.com online. They're online-only purchasable basses. As far as I know, I don't think there are any dealers where you can go into the shop and actually get your hands on one of these, which is a problem, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute and why that's a problem. But I picked one up used. I found it on Craigslist. The new price on this kind of bass, they don't have this exact model on the website right now. They have a kind of similar PJ pickup configuration model that is $170, I think, or $180. So we're going to assume that this is about a $180 guitar when it's new. So you should be able to pick one up used for about half that, so 90 or 100 bucks. Would probably be about what you could expect to pay for one of these. Maybe a little more, maybe a little less, depending on condition, where you live, whether there's a lot of musicians around. I'm in Austin, or near Austin, so I can pick up pretty much any kind of instrument at a reasonable price if I wait around a week or two. So let's talk about what this is, and then we'll get around to the cons, and we'll also do a comparison. I'm going to do an A/B test where we can do a blind listening test, and I haven't done this yet, so I don't actually know how this is going to turn out. With my made in Mexico Fender Jazz bass, pretty much identical configuration to this, but from Fender. It's an actual Fender from Mexico, so a much more expensive instrument than this, about 3 to 4 times more expensive. New, I think the Fender standard jazz bass, I think, is about a $600 instrument. And so you can buy them used for about $300. Maybe a little more, a little less, like as always. So the configuration on this is just like on a Jazz. You have 2 single coil, probably ceramic magnet pickups. I haven't opened it up to look, but that if I were a betting man, that's what I'd bet. Volume, tone in terms of the electronics. An alder body in this case, or at least it looks like alder to me, and all the basses that they're selling on the Rondo Music website right now, even though they don't have this exact model, are all alder bodies. So I'm going to assume this is alder. Maple neck and fretboard. Relatively cheap pot metal, regular Fender Jazz style. Let's get that focused. So regular Fender Jazz style bridge and saddles. Again, they are relatively cheap pot metal, whereas on the Mexican Jazz they're nicer. I'm not sure exactly what the differences are, but I know the saddles on the Mexican Jazz are some kind of cut metal rather than being cast pot metal. And then tuners that look more impressive than they are. It's actually a pretty neat looking design. I think maybe Grover makes something that looks like this. It's sort of a half covered thing. The worm gear is covered, but the gear, the round gear is open. So that's pretty neat. Sort of a weird, maybe not weird, but somewhat uncommon. There are little screws on the end of these that tightens up the actual little flower top. But overall, relatively good parts, certainly comparable to any other bass in this price range, in the $180 to $200 price range. You'd be looking at a Squier Affinity, which is the very low end of the Squier line, if you were going to spend that much money. So yeah, overall, pretty decent parts for the price. I've seen people suggesting that, you know, it's worth many times the price, and it's more, you know, it plays as well as something many times the price. I have objections to that, and I'll talk about why that is. Overall, the impression of the instrument is great. It really looks good. It just feels good in your hands. The fit and finish looks fantastic. But there are some flaws that are problematic. Certainly for a beginner, they would be problematic. Someone who doesn't work on guitars. I found that when I got it, there was a lot of fret sprout, which is indicative of the wood that they used was lower quality and had not been dried as long as some higher quality instruments. I think that's less of a problem on Squiers, though it is still a problem on any low-end instrument. It's going to have cheaper wood. That's part of the trade-off. When you spend $200 or $300 on an instrument new, you can't expect them to use, you know, very expensive anything. So I found that it had quite a bit of fret sprout. Several of these frets had to be filed down to make it comfortable again. But worse, that's kind of a simple thing. Anybody can do that, can sand off the little tips of the things. But I found that in order to get it to not be buzzy in a lot of positions and quite a lot of buzz, I ended up having to do a total fret leveling on this, which is pretty frustrating. Because this is only about a 2-year-old instrument. When I bought it, the guy had it for about 2 years. He had very rarely played it. He had it as a jam instrument that when his friends would come over, he would pull out his guitars, and they would pull this down and they would play. So it didn't get a lot of hours of use, but in just the 2 years that he'd had it, these frets had, or I should say the neck had shrunk around these frets, and so lots of problems sprung up, lots of uneven frets. And so again, I ended up doing a total fret leveling. Just hammering back a few of the frets in didn't do the trick. It was still buzzy as heck. That was what I did at first, and then so I ended up pulling all the strings off and again doing a total fret leveling and redressing all the frets and stuff. A little bit of a half-assed job because I'm hesitant to spend more than a couple of hours working on something that I paid $100 for. So that's kind of problematic. But now that I've done that, it plays awesome. This is a great bass. It feels good, it sounds good, the electronics are not noisy, even when it's just a single pickup. As you may know if you play a jazz bass, or if you're familiar with jazz basses, they are single coil, so there can be hum when you play with just one of the pickups, but they are wired out of phase so that you get hum canceling when you run both pickups full out or full on. So yeah, it took a lot of time to get this to be a really nice playing bass. And that's kind of a problem, and it kind of makes the bargain seem like less of a bargain. And the fact that I mentioned earlier that I think you can only get these online if you buy them new is another problem, because with Squiers you can go into a music store, pretty much any music store in the country. You can go in and pick up some Squiers and try them, and if you take a friend who knows instruments, they can tell you this is a good one, this is a bad one. And if you run your fingers up the fretboard and you can hear whether it's buzzy or not, you can figure out if the action is playable. A good guitar shop, a good music shop will have set it up properly. That pretty much excludes Guitar Center, but a lot of local music stores would do a proper setup on it. Maybe even include as part of the purchase price, oh, you can bring it back a couple of times for setups through the year if you want to, or whatever. Those are pretty common things in music stores. They go a little bit the extra mile. If you were to buy one of these new or used and find that it's buzzy and everything else, and you don't have the skills to fix it yourself, you have to plan to spend a little extra money. $40 or so for just a regular setup, which is straightening the truss rod, adjusting the bridge in terms of level and everything, maybe touching up the frets and stuff. Again, $30 or $40 is probably about what you expect to pay for that in a music store. But if it needs the frets leveled, suddenly this becomes a much more expensive guitar, and so this less than $200 guitar might become a $280 guitar, and at that point you could buy a Squier Vintage Modified, which is probably a better guitar than this one. Just in terms of just the raw, just purely looking at the quality of the components, the cost of the components that go into it, the build quality and everything else. So I'm much less enthusiastic about SX now that I have one in my hands than a lot of people on YouTube and a lot of people on the internet, because this is now a great sounding instrument and a great playing instrument, but I had to put several hours worth of work into it, and I have the tools, I have the leveling beam, and I have the fret rocker, and I have the neck straight edge, the notched straight edge for doing leveling and getting a straight neck and everything. So I have what I need to make this work. I don't know that I can recommend it for a beginner if they don't have a friend who can help them get it into good shape. So that's a little disappointing. The reviews and everything led me to believe that this would be amazing. And I'm less on board with that it's amazing. It is good. Maybe even great for the money in terms of the quality of the components you get. But man, that having to do so much work and having to invest a lot in something right off the bat to get it up to a really nicely playable level with good action and no buzzing up the neck and all of that. So it's something to keep in mind. If you're thinking about this as a first instrument, maybe it's a good idea, maybe it's not. You might get a good one. It's hard to say. This is the only SX instrument I've ever had in my hands, so I don't want to be too hard on it, because now that it's set up, it plays great, it feels great, it looks great. I really love it now. I'm going to be super excited to hand this over to my friend. She's going to be super excited to get it. I think she's going to love to play it and love to learn on it. There's just so many little cool touches. They've got the embossed thing on the back that even my Mexican Fender doesn't have. It's got a two-way truss rod, which is, I don't know that any cheap instruments have a two-way truss rod. I don't think my Mexican Fender has a two-way truss rod. That's a kind of newfangled thing that high-end instruments have had for a few years, but to have it in a low-end instrument like this is interesting. And the truss rod, if you're not familiar with it, is a sort of a mechanism that is inside the neck, just under the fretboard, that runs from either this end to this end or from this end to this end, depending on whether it's a modern guitar where the control, the nut will be up at the top, or an older instrument, a vintage instrument, where the control will be down here. Music Man and some other manufacturers do still put it down here, but they've made it such that you can adjust it just by sticking an Allen wrench in there or a special tool in there and turning it. You don't actually have to take off the neck in those instruments. So anyway, but what it does is you tighten it to straighten your neck. Generally, some really old instruments, it was the opposite. But you tighten it to straighten it. It applies pressure on the truss rod and pushes upward, and then you loosen it, and that relieves pressure and puts relief in the neck, which makes it bow sort of this way. And so if your neck is bowing this way, you tighten it up and it straightens up. And if it's bowing the other way and you get buzz from up here, these notes up here, you loosen it and let some of that relief off, and the strings will pull the neck up. So a two-way truss rod, that's really cool. And in general, there is a lot to love about it. It's quiet, even with one pickup, as I mentioned. Tone works well and sounds good. It does what it's supposed to do. The pickups sound really good. Certainly for a cheap instrument, it sounds better than but I think a $200 instrument has any right to sound. I don't know that it sounds better or as good as the Mexican Fender. I'm pretty sure it sounds worse, but I haven't done a side-by-side comparison, and we'll do that in a minute. We'll do a blind listening comparison, and that will let us, we'll all know, we'll all find out. I will be hearing it for the first time. I will say, though, that one little quirk of this is that the sound of this is a little thin, especially on the middle two strings. These two strings here, for whatever reason, there's a whole range of notes. And I don't know if you can hear that at all, because I'm just running through a little tiny 25 watt practice amp, and going into a relatively cheap microphone. But it's a little thin on those middle strings, and I don't know if it's because of one of the other differences between this and the Fender. On the Fender, the two center pole pieces, or the pole pieces under the two center strings, are raised up a little bit. So they're higher, closer to the strings than these. And that's to accommodate the radius of the fretboard and the radius of the strings, which this does not seem like the radius is curved enough to require that. This is a relatively flat fretboard, and it maybe is flatter than the Fender. I haven't actually compared the two, and I haven't measured it either. But it seems like, looking at it, that it's not that much of a difference. But for whatever reason, maybe it's that reason, those two strings are a little thin sounding, and so that's the only little bit of a flaw, and it's not even a big deal. It's almost inaudible. I just noticed it when I was being hypercritical of it. A few other things that I noticed, if we're being hypercritical, the pickups were a little high, so slapping would lead to pops, and that's bad. You don't want that. So I lowered them down a little bit, and even aggressive playing with a pick would lead to pops, because the pickups were so close to the strings. Even before, or especially before I raised up, when I did the setup, I ended up raising these up quite a bit. Almost uncomfortably high, actually. They're right at the end of their useful travel on the screws they're on. And that's just to accommodate the way the neck and everything is set up. But so the pickups were a little high, and I had to adjust that down. An amateur might not know what they like and know how to recognize when you're getting pops and stuff just from your pickups being too high. So setup was a little iffy. In addition to the fret problems, in addition to just the other sort of minor setup problems. Another little quirk, if we're being critical, the top string is considerably further from the edge than the bottom string. And that could indicate the bridge is mounted too far off-center, or off-center, not too far, just off-center. Or it could indicate the neck is mounted wrong. It could also just be it could be a combination of things. But the nut is mounted, I don't think you'll be able to see this, but the nut is mounted with a little bit of space at the top. And so it's a little off-center there. which maybe exacerbates the problem. But I measured it earlier, and this is 9 millimeters from the edge, and this side is 5 millimeters from the edge. So we got a 4 millimeter difference there. A couple millimeters would be normal and maybe even acceptable for the bigger string, which moves around a little more. But generally you want to see relatively equal distance. So that's a pretty big difference. Just some sloppiness in their manufacturing. One other thing I noticed that I wanted to call out, and I even made a note to call it out, which is this, and I don't know if you can see that. Yeah, you can see that. So there's a bit of a gap, or it's not a gap, but just a ledge where the electronics panel is mounted versus the pick guard. There's a little space there, and I was gonna call that out and be like, oh, that's kind of sloppy. But then when I was looking over my Fender with the same sort of critical eye, just to kind of figure out what the differences were, I found the same exact problem on the other side on the Fender. And so if they can't get it right on a $600 guitar, and if Fender can't get it right on a $600 guitar, I can't yell it at, I can't rant about SX not getting it right on a $200 or less guitar. So in summary, this is good quality components, less good quality setup and attention to detail. And I might even say it's great quality for the price in terms of all the components. They've put together a lot of really good parts for this price. I'm still hesitant to recommend an SX for a beginner, especially if you're a beginner without tools to work on it and without skills to work on it, or without a friend that will help you work on it, because I have a feeling that QC and setup is where they are making their money. They are just leaving those off the base, off the instruments that they sell. And so what you get is a whole lot of quality components put together in a way that you have to put a lot of work into making it okay. I ended up doing about, like I say, 3 or 4 hours of labor putting this neck into shape, getting this neck into shape. And now that that's done, I feel very good about the instrument, and I would hold it up against any instrument in this price range, or even 50% more, or maybe even twice as much. I don't know what $400 will get you, but certainly this is comparable to like a Squier Vintage Modified or something. But I suspect that you can go to a store and buy a Vintage Modified Squier that's already got good setup and is not going to have quite as many quirky bits. So let us do a listening test. I'm going to make it a blind listening test, and so we'll just label the guitars A and B. I'm not going to tell you which one is A, and I'm not going to tell you which one is B. At the end of it all, we'll come back and we'll talk about what I think of it. Let me know in the comments what you think, which one of these you like, and do it before you find out which one it is. Don't bias yourself by finding out, or listening all the way to the end and going, oh yeah, I thought the Fender sounded better. Go ahead and be brave. Tell me what you think. And the one I'm comparing it to, the instrument I'm comparing it to, is this. Probably a 10 or 15 year old, just a standard jazz bass. This is made in Mexico. No modifications. It is entirely stock, except for the strap locks. Stock pickups. Stock electronics. The electronics are a little beaten up after 15 years of use, so it may even be at a mild disadvantage. But I'm gonna put some new strings on this because I put new strings on the SX, and we'll come back and we'll talk about our findings. I have not done any kind of comparison between the two, so I'm going to be learning as much as you guys are. And heck, who knows, we might find that the SX actually, once set up, sounds as good and plays as good. It certainly plays as well as any bass I own, and I own some very expensive some very expensive instruments. But it took a lot of work to get it there. So yeah, so let's listen, and we'll come back and we'll talk more about it. And we're back. For you guys, it's just a second. For me, it's been about a week or so because I had to deliver the SX to my friend, and I had to get some new strings in here for the Fender. I had to find some time to install those strings and do all that, and then record the Fender parts. So I want to mention one little caveat about those strings. I bought a different brand than I usually buy. I'm kind of not a string princess. I buy whatever's cheap that has pretty good reviews. To me, it doesn't really matter that much. There's very rarely a big difference between any of the quality brands. But I bought a new brand that's on Amazon, and I'm really not happy with them. They suck. So the Fender is going to be at a significant disadvantage in this comparison, but we work with what we've got. I don't really want to wait another week for me to get new strings in and do a new recording and do all that stuff. So we'll run with what we've got, with the understanding that the Fender probably could do a little better with better strings. But anyway, before I get into what I thought of it, I'm going to reveal which bass was which. But go ahead, if you're feeling brave, tell me which bass you like the sound of before. Just say A or B, and maybe why, or maybe if it's mixed, which I felt like it was mixed. I felt like bass A was a better performer in a couple of places, and I felt like bass B was a better performer in a couple of places, which is cool, and that's really surprising for such a low-cost bass to do so well up against a mid-ranged, a mid-price bass. So anyway, so the basses are, bass A was the SX. That's the very low-cost bass we've been talking about this whole video. And then bass B was the Fender. So, for me, I felt like there was no clear winner, which is good for the SX. And we'll blame the strings for the Fender for it not being a solid, resounding success on its part. But nonetheless, I think even if the Fender had good strings, I think the SX would have fared very well. I don't think there would have been any. In any case, there was nothing to no one would say, oh, that's an awful sounding bass. It's a good sounding bass. The places where I could hear a clear difference, where the Fender, sort of the higher price of the Fender showed its value, was in things that needed a lot of dynamic range, very responsive playing, and where it needed a very broad frequency spectrum. In both of those cases, the Fender pickups just sounded better. And the examples where I think that showed most clearly was in the slapping example, which was the bridge pickup with the tone at 100%. I think it was relatively clear that even with the sort of nasally sounding strings on the Fender, it's got more of that pop and the tightness and just the instantaneous response from the pickups that you want to hear. Not at all muddy. So that's a positive thing in the case of the Fender. And then the other place where I think the Fender outshined the SX clearly was in the both pickups configuration, where I played the little riff from the Chain by Fleetwood Mac. And you want that big low end, and you need a little bit of growl around the edges, and when you get up in the higher frequencies, and just all around, it's a big broad sound, and you really want that big broad sound in there. And the SX wasn't quite as didn't have quite as much of the frequencies on display. On the other hand, I think the SX sounded better than the Fender on a couple of the settings. I felt like when I did the Queen riff with the bridge pickup with the tone all the way down, I felt like the SX sounded nicer. The Fender sounded a little nasally. Again, I tend to want to blame the strings, but we won't know if that's the case until I get new strings on it and maybe re-record that part. But in summary, the SX fared very well. It did not embarrass itself. You pretty much have to give them a lot of credit for putting together a lot of good parts. Pretty good pickups for such a cheap instrument. Sounds better than it has any right to sound at that price. And now that it's set up nicely, it plays really well. So if you have a way to get yourself a really well set up SX, maybe you got a friend that'll help you, maybe you have all the tools yourself and you can do it yourself, it's a good sounding bass for a tiny amount of money. So yeah, thank you for watching. Let me know down below what you think. Let me know what you think I should test if I'm doing comparisons between instruments in the future. Is there anything you feel like I left out? Yeah. And let me know what your favorite cheap bass is. I've also recently picked up a Squier Vintage Modified because I wanted to test the theory that the Vintage Modified was a better instrument than the SX. So my next video, or maybe not the next one, but maybe in a couple of weeks, I will pull up this same file, this same comparison file, and I'll do a mix with the Squier Vintage Modified. Because I'm theorizing that it's going to be a slightly better bass for slightly more money. But we won't know until we test. So yeah, like and subscribe if you want to see me do more videos like this. And let me know down below what you thought of this one and which one of these basses you like the sound of best.